Here to dive into industry trends with leading ETF experts, this is ETF Spotlight with Nina Mishra.
Hello and welcome to ETF Spotlight. I'm your host, Nina Mishra. My guest today is Matt Markovich, Managing Director at Innovation Shares. We're talking about cannabis and blockchain ETFs. Matt, welcome and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Nina. I appreciate it.
So let's start with the investment case for cannabis. Some have compared it to investing in alcohol post-prohibition. And I read a recent report from Barclays which said that the U.S. cannabis market would be $28 billion if legalized today and grow to $41 billion by 2028. So tell us why investors should consider marijuana stocks and ETFs. What kind of growth do you expect in the legal marijuana market, and what will drive this growth?
Sure. We tend to think a little bit further out here at Innovation Shares, and by that I mean by 2040, Seaport Securities, which is a firm that has some research opinions on cannabis stocks, they have an estimate of $630 billion for the cannabis industry globally, again, by 2040, and the U.S. market representing $94 billion of that 630, clearly the largest market there. And this is up from market size right now of around $12 billion globally, with North America representing anywhere between $9 and $9.5 billion. Most of that being the U.S., of course. So it is an industry that I believe we have not seen even, the growth is not ramped up yet because so much of the industry has not been legalized around the world yet.
So what will drive this growth in your view?
Yeah, so today only Canada and Uruguay allow adult usage of marijuana. And however, there are 35 countries, at least, with medical usage allowed. And as new markets start to open up, again, globally, that growth is going to be exponential, especially as you see an increase in, one, recreational usage. That's a more retail demand. And two, the consumer packaged goods, or CPG, you'll hear it referred to often, and pharmaceutical usage will increase as well. And those are the two main drivers, again, the recreational and the CPG and pharmaceutical usage that are going to drive that towards the $630 billion market value by 2040.
That makes sense. So in the U.S., recreational use is now legal in 11 states and the District of Columbia. Illinois became the latest state to legalize recreational use of marijuana, and that would be effective January 1st, 2020. Medical use is legal in 33 states, but it's illegal at the federal level. So do you expect any change in the federal policy anytime soon?
I would not expect full federal U.S. legalization, not anytime in the next year or two. However, there are some important regulatory catalysts on the horizon, such as the States Act and the SAFE Act, both of which will bring more of the capital markets to allow banking for cannabis companies here in the U.S. And to actually put more of the onus on states to enforce cannabis laws. So I don't want to say a quasi-federal legalization, but it's progress nonetheless. And both of these bills are kind of working their way through Congress in various forms right now.
Okay, let's talk about your ETF now. It's very appropriately called the Cannabis ETF, ticker THCX. Tell us a little bit about this ETF and how constituents in the index, how they are selected and weighted.
Sure. So THCX is a passively managed ETF, meaning it tracks an index. And the index that it tracks is named the Innovation Labs Cannabis Index. It is an index that is rebalanced monthly. and at each rebalance, no stock can represent more than 8% of the portfolio. In addition, much like the methodology that we use to build our other ETF, we use a natural language processing algorithm to help look at media sentiment for the stocks could be eligible in the portfolio. In order to be eligible for the index, stock must have a minimum of a U.S. $100 million market cap. And this way we just ensure that there's appropriate size, including diversity in terms of the amount of stocks that can be in the portfolio. Right now we have 35 stocks in the index, and 18 of which are Canadian licensed producers, or LPs, and we're allowed to own stocks on five exchanges, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, the Toronto Stock Exchange, the Toronto Stock Exchange Venture, and the Australian Stock Exchange.
Okay, so I'm looking at the top holdings, and I'm not at all surprised by the top holdings. Kronos, GW Pharmaceuticals, Canopy Growth, Tilray, and Aurora Cannabis. And you mentioned that holdings are selected using AI and according to media sentiment. So obviously these companies usually get a lot of media mention. So tell us a little bit about some of these top holdings.
Sure. One of the more interesting stories is GW Pharmaceuticals. They are a cannabinoid-based pharmaceutical company that actually has the first FDA-approved drug called Epidiolex, which is used for the treatment of epilepsy. They have earnings coming up on August 7th, and this will be I believe the second quarter in which they should show meaningful sales for this drug. And it's a very specific cannabis industry specific story, sort of like other companies in the portfolio, like Kronos, as you mentioned, at the top of the holdings list right now, and Canopy Growth, which are two of the larger licensed producers in Canada that are building brands across the many provinces in which they operate.
Okay, so some experts have concerns about lack of enough investable names in the legal cannabis space, and there are others who say that valuations are just too high. What's your take?
Well, that's why we have the minimum $100 million market cap as the hurdle for companies to make it into the index, just to even be considered, of course. And you have to remember that we're very early on in the life cycle of cannabis here in terms of not only legalization. This is an industry that's been operating in the shadows for quite some time around the world. And you're just starting to see the past couple of years more companies access the public markets where they're allowed. And again, you'd expect that in an industry that's in its infancy right now. In terms of valuation, it's kind of tough to say that valuations are high across the board, especially given the different types of exposure that the portfolio has to cannabis, which I can talk a little bit about later. But the bulk of the portfolio right now is in the Canadian licensed producers. Are they trading a little rich right now? One can make that argument, especially relative to earnings expectations and the growth of the Canadian market. But I guess what I want to impart on listeners is that the cannabis story is not sort of relegated to just one country. It's not relegated to the U.S. or Canada. This is a very global narrative right now. And have many companies in the portfolio, such as KOIN Life Sciences and Yellow, which both of those have their main exposure to the cannabis market down in Mexico and Latin America. So again, across the board, it's tough to say that this space is overvalued. When you have such high growth potential and there aren't many comparables to other industries necessarily, you're sort of dealing with a new frontier of where this industry could go.
So there are 4 more pot ETFs on the market now, and at least one by Global X is in the pipeline. The four that are on the market now are ETF MG, Alternative Harvest ETF, ticker MJ. This actually changed its index in December of 2017. Then there's the Advisor Shares Pure Cannabis ETF, ticker YOLO. A new one by Amplify Seymour Cannabis ETF, ticker CNBS. And the latest entrant in this space is the Cambria Cannabis ETF, ticker TOC, which is also the cheapest. Now, 3 of these ETFs are actively managed. And some experts actually say that active management is important in this industry because it is evolving quickly. So tell us how THCX is different from other pot ETFs.
As you mentioned, it's a passively managed ETF, but where we're different is, one, it's a pure play portfolio, so we don't have any tobacco or alcohol stocks in the fund. Primarily, tobacco is a slow to no growth industry, and cannabis is a growth industry, and it's a multi-generational growth story. Right. And as a result, we don't believe that tobacco stocks have any place in the portfolio. We also rebalance the portfolio monthly in accordance with the index. That helps to smooth out the volatility. This is a very volatile sector, as you may know, where stock picking could be treacherous. You have performance differences in the top performing stock and the bottom performing stock each month, upwards of 100%. And that is potentially a very scary place to be, just putting your eggs in just one or two baskets when you're trying to pick stocks here. So again, our monthly rebalance should help to smooth out that volatility. And we also cap each stock's weighting at 8% on that monthly rebalance. So in addition to the volatility smoothing factor, we want to be able to stay on top of new entrants to the capital markets. So whether it be IPOs, you see a lot of companies uplisting to one of those 5 exchanges that I mentioned before, Nina. So if a company's trading OTC or listed on the CSE up in Canada, when they trade on the TSX or TSXV, then they are eligible for the index at that point. So we want to be able to evaluate those companies as long as they meet our criteria for eligibility, and take them and get them into the portfolio, as our products fit.
Okay, so I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about your blockchain ETF. The ticker is KOIN there. Now, obviously, there was a lot of interest in Bitcoin and blockchain, the technology that underpins digital currencies, in January 2018, because Bitcoin was soaring then. After that, Bitcoin plunged and investors forgot about all these ETFs. Now, Bitcoin has risen again over the past few months, and that's thanks mainly to Facebook's plan to launch a cryptocurrency called Libra. It is, of course, down from its recent highs now, but I wanted to talk about your ETF. Have you seen any revival in investor interest recently? The ETF is called the Innovation Shares NextGen Protocol ETF. Ticker again is KOIN, KOIN. And in fact, the SEC did not allow the use of word blockchain in the name of blockchain ETF, so that is why they don't have that word in the name. So talk a little bit about your blockchain ETF. What kind of holdings does it have, and is there any recent interest?
So I will say that we have seen an uptick in interest along with the, we'll call it recovery or upward momentum in cryptocurrency prices. And that's for better or for worse. I mean, I say that because what we've always tried to impart over the past year and a half to investors is that blockchain is more than Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. The uses, both from a retail and B2B perspective, enterprise perspective for blockchain, are vast, and they're still being determined in terms of new applications for blockchain technology are being announced almost daily. But still a lot of investors can't break the association of Bitcoin and blockchain. Mm-hmm. So we have seen an interest. We've been getting more questions and kind of inbound calls on our blockchain ETF KOIN, as you mentioned. But it's not the performance of which it did hit a touch of 52-week high today. It's not really associated with the cryptocurrency price. There's no correlation there. Again, because blockchain is more of the application of the technology, and the companies in the portfolio are companies that are utilizing blockchain to either drive operational efficiencies or companies that are driving revenue from blockchain, including Intel, NVIDIA, Taiwan Semiconductor.
Okay, so I'm looking at the top holdings, and you mentioned some of them. Taiwan Semiconductors, Intel, and NVIDIA are the top holdings. How are companies selected and weighted in the index? Do you use the same methodology using AI and media sentiment for selecting companies?
Yes. That's actually the usage of our patent-pending natural language processing algorithm was first applied to help build this portfolio because, as I think we discussed it last time, themes span borders and they cross sectors. As a result, we don't take the traditional approach of having a traditional research team looking at these stocks. We're using AI, as you mentioned, to read credible media articles around the world and identify stocks that have a relationship to a theme given particular keywords. And then after they've been identified, we look at the sentiment. Is it positive or negative in terms of that stock relative to that theme? And that's a major input into how the index is built for KOIN's portfolio.
Okay, great. So I want to talk a little bit about thematic investing in general. And so obviously these ETFs, they have a lot of growth potential, but they are much more volatile than the broader market due to their narrow focus. So tell us how thematic ETFs like THCX and KOIN, how do they fit in an investment portfolio?
Sure. So generally, thematic ETFs are going to fit into the growth sleeve of an equity portfolio, right? Because you're trying to tie the growth of the companies to a longer-term growth trend. And as a result, as you mentioned, these stocks, they may be a little bit more volatile. However, with that volatility, you expect, higher growth. So, for instance, the beta on THCX's portfolio relative to the S&P 500 is around 1.6, right, which you would probably describe as a high beta portfolio. Yep. So while you may not put your entire equity allocation into a thematic ETF, you're going to invest in it because you like the longer-term drivers of those structural trends. Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of owning stocks that are going to be in the growing industries as opposed to stocks that are in slowing industries, such as say tobacco or maybe utilities, or consumer staples, where the growth expectations aren't as great.
Yeah, that makes sense. A small allocation in the portfolio according to your risk tolerance makes sense given the growth potential. And that's all we have time for today. Matt, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about the CTF, please visit THCXETF.com. Make sure to be on the lookout for the next edition of ETF Spotlight, and also make sure to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions, please email podcast@zacks.com.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.